here's the big question. You're interested in value investing and valuing and evaluating businesses on a deep level, but you don't know how, even after researching for hours, probably dozens of hours, hundreds of hours on the internet, and because nobody else shows you how to do it. This podcast has all those answers and much more about value investing in finance. My name is Jason Rivera. Welcome to Value Investing in Your Car. Hey, Jason here. In this episode of Value Investing in Your Car, I'm going to do a review of what's one of my favorite books I've ever read, to be honest with you. Before we get to that, I want to remind you that this series is now available as a podcast for free anywhere in the world on all major platforms: iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Anchor, SoundCloud, Castbox, podcast.com. If it has a podcast platform, or if it is a podcast platform, this series should be available as a podcast anywhere for free. And you can listen to this entire series for free anywhere in the world using any of those platforms. Okay. So last week I reviewed one of the best things I've ever learned from The Men Who Built America, which chronicled the rise of Cornelius Vanderbilt, John Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and others, but those are the four main ones. And told you why I thought that was so fantastic, why I started learning that about, or why I started watching that series, and it was because of the book I'm reviewing today. Book Titan, John D. Rockefeller's biography by Ron Chernow. If you don't know who Ron Chernow is, you probably haven't read any biographies. He's one of the, in my opinion, probably one of the best biography writers in the entire world. He's written biographies, I believe. No, that was Walter Isaacson. He's a great one too. But Ron Chernow has written some great biographies. Titan, chronicles the life of John D. Rockefeller in extreme detail, all the way from his birth. Before that, I don't know if I think it starts with his grandparents coming over here from Europe, goes through his parents, his brothers and sisters, or him and his brothers and sisters, his kids, his grandkids. So it covers, 6 generations of Rockefellers, and it centers on John D. Rockefeller. His life, his rise, what kind of led him to be the person he was, what led him to some of his personality traits and quirks, and his business acumen, his business ruthlessness, him being the wealthiest American adjusted for inflation ever, or eventually becoming the wealthiest American ever. Inflation adjusted at 60, the modern day equivalent of about $660 billion. For reference, today's most valuable, most wealthy American is Jeff Bezos, and is around $120 billion. At his height, John D. Rockefeller was worth the equivalent of $660 billion today, which is just insane. But love this book. One of the best biographies I've ever read. Not only I love detail when it comes to this kind of stuff, because I want to kind of not necessarily figure out, but learn the factors that led to somebody's personality traits, their ambitions, their passions, their work ethic, how they built their fortunes, how they built their business empires. I want to learn kind of the backstory about all this. So I love detail. I don't know how many pages the book is because I listened to an audiobook. It's a 35-hour listen on audiobook. It was just frankly amazing. If you've watched this series or watched this blog for any amount of time, you know I love financial history books. This, in my opinion, is not only one of the best biographies I've ever learned from, but it's one of the best kind of historical business nonfiction books I've ever read, because it chronicles the rise of the entire Standard Oil how he built it, how he came across it, how he came up with the idea for it, how he expanded, how he went through competing with people, how he went through rivalries with people like Andrew Carnegie, how he dealt with people like Cornelius Vanderbilt, how he dealt with competitors who were trying to tar and feather his name, how he dealt with people slandering him in some cases, how he became the world's foremost philanthropist at the end of his career, and he gave away literally hundreds of billions of dollars in money and funds and time that led to cures for things like hookworm, specifically. I don't know if he helped cure yellow fever, but I know his institute got rid of yellow fever in the RFIM, the medical institute. Rockefeller, I don't remember what it stands for, but the RFIM was the institute that he started, I believe it was in the 20s, late 1910s, early 1920s, that revolutionized researching and trying to figure out how to eradicate diseases, again, like hookworm, yellow fever, other stuff that literally saved tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people's lives. Flu vaccine, I believe, was another one that their institute came up with. Educating black Americans at a time when segregation was still rampant in the South. Educating women in a time where women, frankly, didn't have that many rights. He was far ahead of his game in terms of philanthropies and also building his company, Standard Oil, which is where most of his fortune came from. Actually, I'll get back to that later because most of his fortune did not come directly from Standard Oil. But how we kind of came up with the idea to refine oil and kerosene, how he went about doing scientific research, or hiring people to do scientific research on the many uses of refined oil, what we now call gasoline, and we put in our cars every day and have for almost 100 years now, was a byproduct of refining oil and was thought to be useless until him and his scientists figured out a way that it would be the perfect, I think they call it lubricant in the book, the perfect kind of lubricant for the combustion engine, to run the combustion engine. It's just, I can't, obviously this book's 35-hour read. I think it's the books itself is like 700 pages, 800 pages, something like that. I can't go over everything, but highly recommend this book if you are into business, if you are starting a business, if you're an entrepreneur, if you are an innovator, if you're an investor, anybody in this arena who is watching this video should probably read or listen to this book. That's how good it is. In terms of my best books or best things I've ever learned from, I said last week that The Men Who Built America was probably in the top 10. This is probably one of my, if not my favorite book or thing I've ever learned from, in the top 3, definitely. Again, you know how much I read, how much I learn. The reading and learning for me is constant. This is one of my favorite resources I've ever learned from. It goes over the good things about him. It goes over the bad things about him. It goes over the things that people used to consider bad. Kind of made him a notorious figure in the United States and around the world. And at the end of his career, he was known as a jolly, and life, he was known as a jolly old man, and he loved playing with kids and telling jokes. And again, he gave away literally hundreds of billions of dollars to charities in his lifetime, the equivalent of hundreds of billions of dollars in modern money, and to charities, and again, educating blacks and educating women and eradicating diseases, and he founded the University of Chicago, among other things. I can't really express how phenomenal the book is. Frankly, I knew of the name John D. Rockefeller, of course, being in finance and investment, but I didn't really know anything about him, other than most people kind of viewed him as a predatory capitalist So I kind of want to give my thoughts on that. Is I don't really fault him or Vanderbilt or Carnegie or J.P. Morgan or any of those guys in that era for doing what they did, because there were no rules back then, um, to kind of not necessarily govern things, but uh, there were literally no rules barring pretty much anything they did. And most of the stuff they did, especially in terms of John D. Rockefeller, I view as competition and just doing better than your competition. Some of the stuff, the bribery stuff from Standard Oil, of course, I don't agree with, no matter what time frame. Um, but a bribery of politicians specifically. But again, that was happening from pretty much everyone back then. So most of this stuff, especially in terms of John D. Rockefeller, I don't necessarily fault him and Standard Oil for that kind of stuff. Other than the bribery stuff, again, I don't agree with that at pretty much any point in time, because that's just wrong any point in time. But some of the other, the competitive stuff that led to the Sherman Antitrust Act, that as investors you see pretty much anytime you read a financial statement, you see some form of a mention of that. I think it's you don't necessarily see the Sherman Antitrust Act, but you see the Securities and Exchange Act of 1933, 1934, I think is the years. When you read an annual report, you pretty much always see those mentioned. But you're seeing Sherman Antitrust Act being brought up against Google and Facebook and Amazon, giants to this day that I don't want to say it wasn't necessarily necessary, because actually I'm going to say it wasn't necessary even back then, because Standard Oil's so-called monopoly, and it wasn't really ever a monopoly in my opinion, but so-called monopoly was eroding as time went on anyways. So it was just government 20, 30 years late to the party like usual, trying to break up the big bad businessman. In my opinion, again, other than the bribery, they were just out competing and out doing a better job than their competitors. In terms of how they treated workers, of course, that's not good. I don't agree with that, of course. But again, nobody really knew any better back then. Henry Ford, I think it was 20 years after kind of the height of Standard Oil, kind of brought in the 40-hour, 5 days a week work week, standardized that. But until then, you pretty much worked, and that was it. So again, it wasn't great, but I don't necessarily fault them for that either. But there are there are several overriding factors that, in my opinion, not necessarily led Rockefeller to becoming who he was and the master business person that he was, but can help all of us in modern day times that he practiced all the time. They bring up Stoicism a lot in the book. And I'm not necessarily a huge practitioner of it. I've worked to control my temper and stuff like that, and just over time, and I've gotten a lot better at it. But just Stoicism, for those of you guys that don't know, is that is pretty much just dealing with things in your control, not letting outside forces kind of ruin your day per se, or ruin your life, or not having a victimhood mindset. Doing your best with your kind of abilities and controlling what you control, which I've talked about before on this blog. That was brought up a lot in the book. Perseverance and the amount of risk taking these guys were doing. And that's why another reason I don't necessarily hold a lot of the stuff they did against them, again, except the bribery and how they treated workers, is because these guys, Rockefeller, who we're talking about today, Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, Henry Ford, later, they literally created entire industries that are commonplace today, that were thought of as magic at the time. Stuff spurting from the earth, black stuff spurting from the earth, and creating lubricants and kerosene that you can use as lights, and then later gasoline out of it to power cars, which we're still using today. J.P. Morgan and Thomas Edison and later Nikola Tesla with electricity and literally flipping a switch and lighting up your entire house or office building so you could work. Before this time, people couldn't work after dark unless they had a bunch of candles. And even then, candles, if you ever had a power outage, don't use too much light. Cornelius Vanderbilt, connecting the entire United States for the first time ever. These guys, in about a 50-year time period, literally transformed the entire world, not just America, but the entire world. And a lot of stuff we're doing today is still based off these guys' technology, specifically Nikola Tesla and JP Morgan, their AC patents. We still run almost all of our electricity, as far as I know, off AC currents versus DC currents, which is what Edison came up with. We still run majority of our cars on gasoline. Until John Rockefeller came up with pipelines. Nobody really knew how to transport oil and gas and kerosene efficiently. Pipelines we still use constantly today, at least in the United States. I don't know about other parts of the world, but in the United States we use pipelines a lot to transfer natural gas and oil. Cars, Henry Ford. Carnegie was still, literally, it was, before Carnegie came along, it was too expensive to use steel. These guys, again, literally in a 50-year time period, transformed the entire world. And we're still on that path today that they set out, more than 100 years ago, 120, 130 years ago, about in the 1870s is when it started. Is when this kind of boom, 1870s to 1920s is when this boom kind of innovation boom kind of started with these guys, and it's just phenomenal stuff. It's just kind of frankly crazy to kind of think about all of the stuff that we're still using that's based on 100 or 150-year-old technology that we're still using today. And it's the majority of these ideas sprung from these 4, 5, 6 guys' heads. It's just kind of crazy to think about. Stoicism, they talk about a lot in the book. John D. Rockefeller was extremely religious until his dying days. Perseverance, I already talked about, and the risk-taking, again, literally creating entire industries out of what people thought was a waste product. They didn't know what oil was before they used it. They thought gasoline was a byproduct, a wasteful byproduct, until they turned it into until the combustion engine came along with Henry Ford. Perseverance, risk-taking, Stoicism, super religious, the belief the Rockefeller and these other guys had in themselves and their vision was crazy. They had extreme belief that what they were doing. Sorry, I got a phone call. So it's crazy the amount of belief these guys, utmost belief that what they were doing was right for not only themselves but the entire world. John D. Rockefeller's kind of overarching vision was, I'm helping light literally the entire world. Without kerosene and without my innovations, without my kind of vision and foresight, we would still be only able to be up, depending on the time of year, 12 hours a day, or be up and be productive 12 hours a day. And then again, of course, later gasoline and gasoline stations and all that. But I want to talk about, so those are kind of the overarching themes that I wanted to talk about from this book. I alluded earlier to John D. Rockefeller not making most of his money from Standard Oil. He kind of did, but he retired early. He retired, I don't remember his exact age, but I think it was in his mid-40s to mid-50s. He retired after he built the Standard Oil empire from literally nothing to being the biggest corporation in the history of the entire world. Adjusted for inflation, I think it's still the biggest. I don't actually, now that I think about it, I don't think they mentioned that. But that wouldn't surprise me if it was. But he actually made more money after he retired because he had so much capital and he reinvested it so well and was still earning Standard Oil dividends that were paying out at points 10 to 50% of their profits to shareholders, and he was the biggest shareholder by far. That at his, I think when he retired, he had the modern day equivalent of something like $1 billion, if I remember from the book right, $1 billion. And he grew that from the time he retired at Standard Oil. From I put retired in quote marks because he was still kind of getting reports, but he wasn't doing with any of the day-to-day operations or anything like that. But when he retired at the time of his mid-40s, mid-50s, he was worth about $1 billion or $2 billion today's equivalent. And then he grew that through dividends, through share appreciation, through investing this excess capital well. Even with him spending, again, the equivalent of hundreds of billions of dollars on charities and fighting diseases and educating people, he still at his height was worth about $660 billion because of his ability. So he went in a couple decades from $1 to $2 billion when he was retired to being worth $660 billion. That's insane. That's insane. And he made a lot of mistakes too. I wouldn't consider him a great investor like a Warren Buffett or Seth Klarman or any of these guys. I wouldn't consider him. He made some great kind of strategic investments and then sold them to people like Carnegie and stuff like that. But most of his kind of net worth after he retired was from the dividends. And then reinvesting those dividends from the Standard Oil stock into other assets, which is insanely powerful. Another thing that led to his great wealth was lack of income taxes back then. And also when the U.S. government broke up Standard Oil after the Sherman Antitrust Act, they broke it up into, I think it was 37 different companies at the time, which became companies like Chevron, Exxon, Mobil, some of the biggest oil and natural gas and natural resource companies in the entire world. So as these companies got broke off and became their own separate entities, and they continued to take over the world in some people's estimations and grow their footprint again around the world, his net worth just skyrocketed. It went straight up. So these kind of factors are what led him to becoming the richest person, again, modern day equivalent in American history, and one of the richest people ever in world history. Fantastic book. Again, you can probably tell not only by me talking about it for everything I've talked about, because normally these episodes are 10 to 12 minutes, 20 to 15 minutes long typically. We're at about 22 minutes now. And also the length, I've talked about it. Again, these are 10 to 15 minutes long, and I've been talking for 22 minutes and I'm still not done. So I could talk for hours about this book. That's how fantastic it is. I highly recommend you read it. Highly recommend you listen to it if you love listening to audiobooks. Absolutely fascinating. As somebody who wants to build a great business that's around for a long time and give a lot of money away to a lot of people and literally help change the world like Rockefeller did, this was a fantastic, amazing, one of the best books, one of the best resources I've ever read from or learned from. Cannot recommend it enough. Definitely will be on the must-read list once me and my team update that. And again, just cannot recommend it enough. If you've read this book or listened to this book, let me know in the comments below what you thought of it. Obviously, you know that I love it. If you disagree, did I miss something that you thought I should have talked about? Let me know in the comments below. I answer all comments myself. Same thing on YouTube. I answer all comments myself. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, let me know in the comments below. If you are watching on YouTube, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you're notified anytime we release a new video. And we're up over 450 videos as of this recording. We're releasing new videos all the time. If you're listening on a podcast, thank you for listening, and make sure to subscribe, love, like, share, all that kind of stuff as well, so you're notified anytime we release a new episode. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Talk to you soon. Hope you enjoy this review, and hope you read and learn from this book and enjoy it as much as I did. Thanks. Bye.